All right, folks, thanks for joining us again for another session of Cyber Security Decoded. I'm Steve Stone from Rubrik Zero Labs. For those joining us for the first time, we use these sessions to talk about key items in the cybersecurity threat landscape, as well as how other senior leaders operate in these environments. We've been very lucky to have a range of guests before to talk about industry responses, government regulations, and a range of things that we see across threats. Today's session, I'm really excited for. We're going to focus primarily around how cybersecurity leaders communicate and with a specific focus on Asia Pacific, which will be new for us in the series. Part of the reason I'm really excited to get into this. Our guest today is Shamane Tan. She's joining us from Asia Pacific, as I mentioned earlier. She's got a range of really great experience. I'll just hit a few of the quick highlights. She's the author of several books to include Cyber Risk Leaders and Cyber Mayday and the Day After. Her most recent book is Building Cyber Resilience, a cyber handbook for executives and boards, and that's been featured on Forbes Australia top list of books for CEOs. She's also a recipient of a global top 20 cybersecurity influencer award and has been named the 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australians. She's an advocate for women's empowerment and thought leadership. She's founded a transcontinental cyber risk and executive meetup spanning across Asia Pacific. And as if all that's not enough, she's also the Chief Growth Officer at Sekuro, a leading cybersecurity and digital resiliency solutions partner. Shamane, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. I'm smiling because I think that's quite a mouthful.
So if you're okay with it, I'd like to just jump right in. I've got so much I'd like to
Yes,
ask you about.
yes, definitely. I'm excited. Let's go for it.
All right, let's do it. So I think it's a fair assessment to say you're our first actual Asia Pacific expert. A lot of past guests have worked in Asia Pacific, but I think you're the first one that we would really consider to be a deep expert in the region. So I'd like to really just dive right into that. From a US based perspective, where my background comes from, we often talk about differences in working across Asia compared to other parts of the world. The North America is fairly similar to EMEA. South America is kind of like North America. But we often, from this direction, talk about Asia as a very unique place. I'd be really interested in kind of starting off the top. What do you see from the other direction? Are there actual meaningful differences? What's your take on that?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and I think we should exchange notes later because I'm keen to hear what the US perspective of Asia is. But what I would say is that Asia is very diverse. I mean, there's so many different regions, there's a lot of different cultures. So it's hard to also put them in that box, I would say. But generally, you will find that, people can be more conservative. They tend to be more reserved as well. I would say maybe less risk adverse. So, even just in the experience of like when I was doing research for my books, speaking to and interviewing different people, we're talking about more than a couple of hundreds across Asia, Pacific, and US. I saw a huge difference. Like the level of transparency that maybe I get from speaking to the US folks was a lot more easier to get. Initially, they're willing to share, I guess, lessons learned, even things that might be a bit embarrassing, right? Because they have made mistakes, but they want to learn from the lessons from that, and they're willing to share that as well. Whereas I think in Asia, you have to take more time to really invest in building deep relationships. I think once you've built that trust with them, then you find that they actually become more open and willing to give back and share, and they can be really loyal and supportive as well once they really know they know you, they know how authentic your mission is and what you are about. So I would say that's a bit of a difference in, I guess, the culture as well play a big part in it. I think, yeah. Another thing to probably be conscious of is that countries in Asia, some of them perhaps are more highly regulated. So they have that culture of compliance. And that also does factor in how they are brought up and their behaviors and how they act.
So I'd like to take that same topic and just rotate it a little bit. One of the things that we look at Rubrik Zero Labs is, We focus very heavily on threats to data and data security. And we also spend a great deal of time baselining. It's hard to study anomalies if you're not comfortable with the baseline. So we spend a lot of research on what a typical organization looks like, what are the variations, and we do actually see differences in environments across the regions. And Asia Pacific tends to be the most different from architecture level. And I think just one example I would give is we provide a data security score. It's a machine evaluation of the environment, 0 to 100 of what we see as a data security posture. I won't bore anybody with how we do that. But globally, we see a pretty consistent score as a typical score of right around 67 out of 100. As an example, in the Americas, it's 68. In EMEA, it's 67. But when we look at Asia Pacific, that typical score is about a 56. So it's a demonstrable difference. So I'd be really curious with no background on how we make that data and how we come up with that. As an expert, particularly in cybersecurity and the Asian technology landscape, what do you think causes these environmental and posture differences by the regions?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think for listeners as well, we need to go into the report, right? To understand more about like how you got the survey results. I would say a few key elements would have to come into play. So like the cultural and regulatory factors would definitely influence how different regions in Asia Pacific collect and store data. A lot of times they also can be more conservative. So we need to look into that. There is also the different stage of digital transformation, right? So if some regions, I would say, are actually maybe slower in that, which means that will take time for them to also generate, and thereby they would have stored less data as well. So, take for example, like trends in the US that we see. Generally, it takes a couple of years before they come to like maybe Australia, and then it trickles also to like, for example, other parts in Asia. So I had the legendary Steve Katz, interviewed him a couple of years back actually for one of my very first book, and he was talking about cyber risk. Like back in 1995 when he was the very first CISO. I mean, he's well known for taking on the title actually as the world's first CISO, and he took that when he was Citicorp's CISO, and back then he was already talking to boards about cyber risk being a business risk. But if you look at that term, in Australia, it was only a couple of years back that people started to shift from saying, cybersecurity, information security as a language that we should be using more actively, a business risk, and speaking that to the boards. And now, of course, everyone is speaking about that everywhere, but it took time, I would say, for it to come here. And even in the title, the CISO title, it's a lot more prevalent there in the US, right? But I think it only got to Australia maybe like more than a decade ago. So still a fairly new title. A lot of organizations still don't have that. And then if you talk about maybe red teaming, right? We're doing that a lot here in Australia too, but maybe in Malaysia, it's only more recent and more new for them in the last few years. So, I mean, all that does come into play when we look at the different factors as well.
I think that's really, really interesting. And there's something you said that I would just really like to jump right on. And you talk about communication and CISOs and C-suites and boards. So as someone that spends a significant part of your research and your writing and your own speaking focused on communication, I would just be really interested in what advice you give to CISOs and how they should engage C-suites and boards, and how receptive are they to that advice?
In terms of communication, and how they should speak to board, I think generally the cyber leaders are very receptive. I think it's more of a case of how are they able to adapt as well, because a lot of them, you have to look at the backgrounds and experience that they come from. They're all experts in their various areas, technical areas. Many come from the infrastructure background as well, and they are so used to the terminologies and the language that they use in their area of expertise and the peers that they speak to, But I think when they start to bring these conversations to the boardroom, or you're speaking to the other executive leaders, the chief risk officers, the chief financial officers, they come from a different background. They're well educated in the areas of finance and business and communication. So they're also used to speaking in a different way. And I think the CISOs and cyber leaders want to be able to communicate that and bridge that gap with them. But it takes a lot of time as well to really understand the other world, the other side, as we say. How do they perceive risk? How do they talk about it? What's the language they use? And it's about being able to align that so that, when you are speaking their language, it becomes relevant. So there's been a lot of work and progress we have seen in the last few years, for sure. But it's a continuous improvement. It's a lot about raising awareness also and teaching them how they can go about that. So even in the community circles that I run, I was getting like the CEO of like GIA or AICD, which is the term for, the company of Institute of Directors. So they are very familiar with dealing with board directors. And when we hear from their perspective, what do they actually expect from the CISOs? It can be quite refreshing and quite an eye-opener.
I love that take on it, asking what do people expect out of CISOs? I think that's a pretty refreshing view. In my experience, it's been so much of this is what CISOs need to tell boards. And I think you're absolutely right. What CISOs should expect to be engaged on, and that common language, I think, really is important. And I'd like to kind of go back to something you mentioned at the very beginning, talking about building trust. And I'm interested in where these topics merge together, because in all of my experience, especially the senior leader level, it's always about trust. But I think in Asia, it takes on a more profound meaning, and there's no other way, but you have to start with that. So there seems to be a deeper appreciation for these personal relationships and earning that trust. So as someone that works in all of these areas, what do you see that leads to effective trust building and ultimately much better cybersecurity outcomes?
In terms of building trust, again, that could look quite different if you talk about Asia, from Asia perspective, because there's a lot of nuances in like Asia culture. So for example, one of the main commonalities though is respect, right? So you will find it quite interesting, even like the level of respect that people show each other is different according to the age group and the experiences that they come from. And that actually impacts the way people converse and communicate with one another. And that expression of respect is articulated in a different way in different countries based on the culture. So if I give you an example, like in Korea, when people bow, to show a form of respect, and it's a way of greeting as well. But the depth of your bow, how deep you go really is dependent on how much respect you show the other person. So you really respect them, you bow very, very deep, and you do not, lift up your head until they are away, right? And there's a tradition to that and all that. So you do see that happening as well. So, that comes in. That means when we talk about building relationships, you have to put a lot of thought into it. It's about how authentic you can be. And if you talk about how would that look like in building a cybersecurity culture in those countries, then that's quite important when you talk about maybe, mistakes that are made. If there's a security incident, there needs to be an environment where people feel comfortable in actually being honest and upfront about whether it's clicking a wrong link or flagging it up, and knowing that they are not going to be put to shame publicly. It's a good environment where they are comfortable. Good actions are publicly affirmed and appreciated as well. So that encourage positive behaviors. So there's a little bit more, I guess, it's interesting to consider the diverse backgrounds and cultures when you look at, what kind of cybersecurity culture you want to build in an organization.
That really rings true. I mean, my experiences traveling and working through Asia, I had to be told, I had to get pulled out of a room to say, hey, you're looking everybody in the eye in South Korea, and that's considered rude, and it's coming across the wrong way. Or when the first time I went to Tokyo for work, I had to have someone teach me that the process of trading business cards and the appropriate way to bow. And it really mattered. It really mattered because it was, if nothing else, I think showing that respect you're talking about. Like, I'm really trying to be part of a partnership here versus just somebody coming in for a meeting. And I think that's one of the things that I've always really appreciated in Asia, is that there is a way to demonstrate your willingness to show respect. And I think that's pretty interesting. So I could talk about culture stuff forever. I'm a massive culture proponent, but I'd really like to dive into one of your books in particular, because it's a topic that's really near and dear to what we do here at Rubrik. And that's your I believe it's your second book, Cyber Mayday and the Day After. You work squarely and talk about these areas where, for us at Rubrik, that day after that's what we do. Our work focuses on something bad has happened. Let's help organizations move through that day after as fast as possible. And one of the things that just comes up over and over again in our research is there's real trepidation and uncertainty about, can organizations even survive that day after? 96% of senior cybersecurity and IT leaders are concerned about their own organization's ability to effectively recover from a cyber attack in the future. So they're effectively saying that 96 out of 100 of them are saying, we've got real doubts about this. So I'd really like to kind of stress test that with you. Does that match your research and what you saw in Cyber Mayday and the day after? And if so, what can organizations do to change that and be more confident and resilient in these crisis moments?
Yeah, I would say it definitely sounds valid because, when we were doing the research, so my co-author, Dan Lawman, and myself, we interviewed a lot of different cyber leaders, and also studied, an organization, what happened when Cyber Mayday hit. But we didn't just look at what happened during the Mayday. We looked at what happened before it hit. And during the Mayday, then what were their actions? But then we look at the day after, because so many times in the media and the headlines, they only focus on, the juicy news, what's happening right now. There is a cyber incident. But if you revisit, rarely they actually revisit that many months down the line to showcase the same organization and talk about what they have done after that. But that is actually the most crucial part, because it's about whether they have applied the lessons that they have learned, how they have improved and grown from there, so that the same mistakes wouldn't be, happening again. So what we've seen is that even though there's a lot of the reasons that cause these cyber incidents are actually the same for a lot of organizations, but the way they respond and the way they recover look very different for many of them. And there are a mix of organizations from the really unprepared one to even the very proactive one. There are some that have been extremely prepared, doing a lot of great work in building a healthy cybersecurity posture, and have fantastic plans in terms of, their roadmap of what it looks like in the next few years, 3 years, 5 years, and they've been progressing well, but yet they get hit as well. Because as we all know, every company, can be a victim. And if a nation state attacker put their mind to it, the chances of avoiding being hacked or breached is really almost slim to none, right? So what we know, however, is that achieving resilience is a journey, and it starts with the baseline. Combine that with continuous improvements, and then you get real transformation. So the thing is, what we see as well is it's really not just preventive measures. There are some organizations that have just been very focused on that. But the recovery aspect is key, because at the end of the day, you're talking about businesses. The business needs to be sustainable. The business needs to grow. And it's about how quickly can you bounce back from a disruption in your business operation. And if I would add this term as well, it's not just about bouncing back, but how can you bounce forward as well, because it's about growing from there. So one of the chapters we saw, there's actually an organization that went through 2 cyber attacks in 3 months. So that was really a shock to them because there was so much disruption, and they are a massive organization that has a lot of there was a lot of impact to the customers as well, because you're talking about customers from the shipping side, the air side, logistics. There were different components to it. And I think after the first incident, it was a wake-up call. They were doing a lot of things to try to uplift their security strategy, but they didn't have enough time to do that because within 3 months later, the second attack happened, right? So that was no organization wants to be put in that stage. It was very unpleasant. A lot of people remember it still today. And I was speaking to the chairman actually just last year. And what was interesting is to see the development since then, and also the mindset that they have as leaders, because now they are seen as like veterans in this space, because not many organizations have gone through what they've gone through. And the chairman was telling me that even till today, he wears the scars of the battle, right? But people now look to him also for advice on how did they recover, what were the lessons learned that they could apply, and his advice, is definitely very well respected in the industry.
So as you've looked at all these different crisis and cyber events and these days after, are there just recurring trends or themes that you see, or something that if organizations would just do this, they'd be so much better off? I'd be really curious on what you see over and over again.
And that's actually a really good question. A lot of them, the key thing is, unfortunately, sometimes they are mostly caught off guard. I think that's a thing that we do see recurring. But what is another thing that we see is like the mindset, right? It has now shifted. It's no longer, it's not a matter of when, or it's not a matter of if, but when, right? But actually, it's different. It's more of they just didn't think. They know it will happen. They just didn't think that it will happen that soon. So that's something that is recurring as well that we are seeing. Maybe a lot of the CISOs and cyber leaders are very proactive, but maybe it's the business leaders that are a bit more complacent because they see these things happening in the industry. There's a bit of a desensitization as well because there's so much. I mean, in Australia, in the month of October, one of the years, every single few days, there was a new incident that happened in a different industry sector. And for a while, it has worked well in waking up, I guess, the business leaders, because people are using that as examples. But there's also that fatigue, if you overuse that. So what I will say is that going back to recurring themes of things that we've observed is, I think a key area of improvement is that we know this is going to happen, but where a lot of companies have fallen down would be really in the level of communications. So when I talk about communications, like they really need to be trained. And we're not talking about the day-to-day kind of communication skills, but how are the leadership and your spokesperson trained in crisis communication? Because that is a different sort of communication. When a cyber mayday hits, what's the kind of internal communication that's going out? How quick it is, that's also key, right? The timing of it. And then about how can they use the communication to coordinate the response? What kind of external communication is going out, not just to the media, but to the customers? Because timing and also like how clear is the communication, how concise it is, all that will impact the trust with the customers have with your organization, your partners as well. And it does impact like the brand, the reputation. Are you able to upkeep that reputation? Depends on the way you're able to communicate that well. Because in crisis, people look at like some sort of leadership, and the leadership needs to have a clear voice. There needs to be strength, and one very important thing is there needs to be empathy. So I was working with some PhD researchers as well that they studied the console framework. They actually came up with that, and that's a combination of like the medical industry, and they look at aviation industry as well. how they communicate crisis in times to the people. And there's so many transferable lessons that we can actually take and apply in the cyber industry. But yes, empathy is really key because people need that. And if we studied like different communication, if those communication didn't have that, the way people respond to it looks so different and they are less forgiving as well.
I think that focus on empathy is so critical. I think it makes the credibility there. I think it makes the willingness to listen to what's happening. I just think that's such a critical component. So I'm pretty excited to hear you say that because that's a thing that we've talked about a lot over the years. So I'm really excited to hear you advocate for that. Speaking of advocating, one of the things that I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you is, I learn about you and read what you've put out and looked at the interviews you've done and where you've invested your time. You have a clear passion for elevating women and other underrepresented groups across cybersecurity. This is a topic that I think just can't be talked about enough, but I'm really interested in what do you see that's really working well, and where do you see areas of opportunity to diversify in cybersecurity? And then just, do you have a message for anyone who wants to jump into this career from one of these underrepresented groups?
Yeah, I would say the one reason why I'm so passionate about it is because people have been really passionate about it, and I've been a recipient of that. So, an example I always say of actually being of someone who benefited from people who have mentored me, who have believed in me, saw the potential in me, backed me, and have been really great allies as well with, I guess, the vision I have and what I want to do in community. And that's why I'm able to do what I do. And I have the same heart, I would say, to give back because I've met many amazing people who have actually done that for me. And I've seen them doing that for others too. So I think the beauty of our cybersecurity industry is that you'll find that it's quite different from maybe other industry, maybe because I'm biased, but I feel like they are more welcoming. So yeah, the cyber industry is like maybe because they recognize that we really need all sorts of talent. We need all sorts of backgrounds and experience. We need the diversity of perspectives. And that's where we can get a lot of value from that. And maybe that's why everyone is so welcoming. We see allies stepping up, mentors, wanting to take mentees under their wings, giving back. So what I would say is that, the reason being also is we need people who can think out of the box. We always talk about curiosity, right? As long as you are curious about this industry, go for it because you'll never know unless you try it. That's what happened to me. One of the business founders actually took me aside many years ago and told me, saw the potential, asked me to take that leap of faith. It was scary, but when I spoke to many other people, not just women who have moved into cyber from different experiences, I think there was a lawyer, there was someone that was a psychologist. I think it was quite mathematician as well. That really opened up my mind to see the different ways they were able to apply their skills in this sector. And we need that combination of innovators, business minds as well that comes together because you can create a more holistic approach for, to address different cyber challenges. So I guess my encouragement to people who are listening, I would say, be your loudest cheerleaders. There's so many critics out there, but make sure your voice has to be the loudest when it comes to encouraging yourself, and just go for it because the sky's the limit.
And I think, there's nothing but hard challenges and highly complex problems. So the more people, the more talent, the more experiences, the farther we're going to go. And I think that is part of what you're saying. I think that is part of why we see a more open community in cybersecurity is one of the things I love about cybersecurity in particular is at some point it's a meritocracy. There are problems that are going to get solved and it's binary to not make it too basic, but it's ones and zeros. Things get solved or they don't. And there are just so many hard challenges that I don't know anyone that I respect that thinks they've got it figured out. They're actively looking for people to work with and people to learn from. So I think it's such a great topic in this community because I think if any industry can figure these really hard problems out, it can be the cybersecurity community because it's built on curiosity and real problem solving and actually proving out I can do this or I can't. And the other stuff, I would love to say it always fades away, but it has less of a focus. Well, I could literally ask you questions all night long, but I know you've got a lot going on, so I'll leave it with the last question we've done for every one of these. We kind of stumbled into it in the very first one of these we did, but it's kind of become a neat theme for us to explore. So the last question I've asked every guest is the same one. As you look back over your really interesting career and all the places you've been and things you've done, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the future of cybersecurity, and why is that so?
You should do a survey on that as well and see the answers, like where I lean towards. Maybe you can tell me that later after that. I'm curious. But I would say definitely an optimist because I know that there's a lot of pessimists out there already. And, we always need to have hope. And we also need to always have a vision. There's a famous saying, right? Without vision, the people perish. So, if our current generation of leaders have a good vision of how the future of cybersecurity can evolve, the same way it has really accelerated in the past decades, right? This will help us to also support the next generation of leaders coming up. And we want to help them to step up and do more. And actually, that means we need to be optimistic because we need to pass on that vision to them as well, vision of hope, that they can do better. So I'll leave you with that.
Yeah, well, so I'll answer your survey question. Everyone that we've spoken with has said they're optimistic to a
That's so
person,
good.
and very out loud optimistic, very much that it's not just
Excellent.
a byproduct. Every single senior leader we've spoken with has really talked about optimism as a key asset to what they do, and it's a prerequisite for success. And I think, I won't speak for everybody, but in my own experience, I was very pessimistic early. And as I've grown in my career and seen more and tackled more, I've become much more optimistic. And I'll steal one of your own lines. I think it's about that hope, and it's about looking around and seeing there are far more people with far more capability and far more skill sets than when I started doing this. And that's exciting. And it's a real sense for optimism, I think. Well, Shemaine, thank you for your time. I'll let you go. I could ask you a million questions. I really enjoyed this. And just
Yeah,
one last thank
likewise.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Steve, for having me. And thank you to listeners as well.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us for everyone listening to Cybersecurity Decoded. We'll catch you the next time.